Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. Today we're going back to the 19th century, a time when paleontology was a young field, and people were really starting to get fascinated with fossils and ancient creatures.
And there were all these new discoveries happening all the time. It felt like every time you turned around, somebody was digging up some new giant creature or, a new type of dinosaur.
Exactly. And, it was a time when museums were just starting to become popular places to visit, and people were eager to see these incredible fossils firsthand.
Yeah, it really captured the imagination. This idea that these incredible creatures had once walked the earth.
In this kind of environment, one man stands out, Albert Seacock. He made some incredible discoveries that, well, they kind of shook up the scientific community.
He really did. Koch was a German immigrant who came to the United States, and he had this incredible knack for finding these really spectacular fossils.
He's like a rock star paleontologist.
He kind of was. He started out selling fossils to museums, but eventually he decided to open his own museum in St. Louis.
His own museum.
Yeah.
That's ambitious.
Yeah, it was. And it wasn't just any museum. Koch understood the power of a good show. He wanted to create a spectacle. So alongside some genuinely valuable scientific acquisitions like the collection of William Clark from the Lewis and Clark expedition.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
Right. He had some other exhibits that were a little more, shall we say, eye-catching.
A little more on the sensational side.
Exactly. Like there was this exhibit called the Proc.
The proc? What was that?
Well, according to Koch, it was this creature the size of a mule with zebra stripes and the head of a rhinoceros.
Wow. A zebra rhino mule. That sounds like something out of a fantasy novel.
It does, doesn't it? It gives you a sense of Koch's, his showmanship, his tendency to maybe exaggerate a little bit for effect.
So he was a bit of a showman, but he was also making real discoveries, right?
Oh, absolutely. And his most famous discovery was a mastodon skeleton that he called the Missouri Leviathan.
The Missouri Leviathan? That sounds pretty epic.
It was massive. This skeleton was 32 feet long and 15 feet tall. To put that in perspective, that's bigger than a school bus.
Wow. Yeah, that's huge.
It really was. And Koch claimed that this Leviathan wasn't just big, it was proof that mastodons were aquatic creatures.
Aquatic mastodons. It's a new one. I've never heard that theory before.
Well, it was Koch's theory. He pointed to features of the skeleton, like the placement of the tusks.
Oh, yeah. Weren't the tusks kind of sideways?
Yeah, they were. They were pointed sideways instead of forward, like you'd expect in a typical mastodon.
Huh. So he thought that was evidence that they lived in water.
Exactly. He argued that those sideways tusks would have been perfect for, rooting around in lake beds or river bottoms.
Interesting. So how did he even find this Leviathan? Where did the bones come from?
Well, that's where things start to get a little murky. Koch claimed to have excavated the bones from a few different sites in Missouri, places like the Berouse River, Rock Creek in Kimmswick, and the Pomme de Terre River.
So he was digging up these bones himself.
He says he was. But the details surrounding the discoveries, they're a little unclear, shall we say.
Unclear how so.
Well, there are multiple accounts of how he acquired the bones, and some of those accounts don't exactly line up with each other.
So there's some inconsistencies in his stories.
There are, and that's led some people to wonder if maybe he took some creative liberties with the Leviathan.
Creative liberties. You mean like he might have embellished things a little?
Maybe even more than just embellishing. To really understand what Koch did with this Leviathan, we need to compare it to an actual American mastodon.
Okay, so how did his Leviathan stack up against the real deal?
Well, a typical male American mastodon was around 10 feet tall, which is still pretty impressive.
Right, yeah, definitely.
But Koch's Leviathan was more than 5 feet taller than that. He had added extra vertebrae spacers between the bones. And of course, he turned those tusks sideways.
So he kind of supersized it.
He did. It seems like he wanted to make the Leviathan as big and impressive as possible.
So it sounds like Koch was more interested in creating a spectacle than in scientific accuracy.
Well, it's hard to say for sure. What do you think? Was he a deliberate hoaxer? A passionate scientist blinded by his own enthusiasm, or maybe a little bit of both?
That's a good question. It's like he was trying to walk this line between science and showmanship, and he wasn't afraid to push the boundaries a little bit to make his discoveries more exciting.
And that's what makes his story so fascinating. He was a complex character who left behind a complicated legacy.
So what happened next? Did the scientific community just accept Koch's claims about the Leviathan, Or did they start digging a little deeper into his method?
Oh, they definitely started digging deeper. Stay tuned, because in part 2, we're going to dive into the controversy surrounding the Missouri Leviathan and how it ultimately ended up in one of the most prestigious museums in the world.
This is getting good. I can't wait to hear more about this.
Okay.
So Koch's Leviathan is making waves, people are talking, but not everyone's buying his whole aquatic mastodon theory.
Yeah, scientists, they're a skeptical bunch. They like to see the evidence.
And what about those claims he made about finding human-made objects like arrowheads with the mastodon bones? Didn't that raise some eyebrows?
Definitely, it did. And he even included some indigenous legends in his pamphlet about the Leviathan.
Oh, really?
Yeah, which, kind of raises some questions about whether he was using those stories responsibly.
Yeah, I can see how that could be problematic.
It was a different time back then. But even then, people were starting to think more critically about how we use and interpret these kinds of stories.
So it sounds like Koch was really trying to push the boundaries of what people believed about the past.
He was. And not everyone was on board with that. Two paleontologists in particular, Richard Harlan and Paul Goddard, they started to take a closer look at Koch's work.
Okay, so the scientific community is starting to push back a little.
Exactly. Harlan, he was a respected scientist, and he actually gave Koch the benefit of the doubt at first.
Really?
Yeah, he acknowledged that there were some errors in the way the Leviathan was assembled, but he kind of chalked it up to Koch's lack of formal training in anatomy.
So he was willing to cut him some slack.
To a point. But Goddard, he wasn't so forgiving.
Oh, what did he think?
Well, Goddard pointed out that Koch had used glue and extra bones in the Leviathan.
So he was basically accusing Koch of faking it.
Pretty much. And
Yeah.
to make things even more interesting, there was an anonymous rebuttal published defending Koch.
Wow, so now we've got a real scientific mystery on our hands.
Yeah.
Who wrote the rebuttal? Was it Koch himself? Was it one of his supporters? We still don't know.
It's a mystery that's never been solved.
So what happened next? Did Koch just ignore all this criticism?
No, he didn't. In fact, he decided to take his Leviathan on tour.
On tour? Like a rock band?
Exactly. He shipped the whole thing across the Atlantic to London.
Wow, London. That's a bold move.
It was. He wanted to show off his discovery to the world.
So what happened when he got to London? Did the British scientists just fall for his claims?
Not exactly. One of the leading scientists in Britain at the time was Richard Owen.
Oh, yeah. Owen.
Mm.
He's the guy who coined the term dinosaur, right?
That's right. He was a brilliant anatomist and paleontologist. And he wasn't afraid to call out Koch's errors.
Oh, I bet that didn't go over well with Koch.
Probably not. But Owen, he wasn't just criticizing for the sake of it. He actually had some interesting observations about the Leviathan.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, he pointed out that Koch had only corrected one minor error in the Leviathan's assembly.
Only one.
Yeah, he claimed that it was too expensive to fix the other errors. But Owen wasn't entirely convinced.
So he thought Koch was still trying to pull a fast one.
Maybe. But Owen also offered a possible explanation for those sideways tusks.
Oh, really? What do you think was going on there?
He suggested that they might have been caused by compression during fossilization.
So maybe they weren't actually sideways when the mastodon was alive.
Exactly. It was a plausible explanation.
So what did Owen do about the Leviathan? Did he demand that Koch take the whole thing apart and fix it?
No, he didn't. Instead, he did something that really surprised everyone. He bought the Leviathan.
He bought it. Why would he do that if he thought it was so inaccurate?
Well, Owen recognized that even though the Leviathan wasn't perfectly assembled, the bones themselves were still scientifically valuable.
So he saw the potential in it.
He did, and he had a plan for the Leviathan. He took it back to the British Museum and he reassembled it correctly.
Wow, so Koch's flawed Leviathan ended up becoming the world's first accurately articulated mastodon skeleton.
It's kind of ironic, isn't it? But that's science for you. It's a process of constant revision and refinement. We learn from our mistakes and we build on the work of those who came before us.
And what about Koch? What happened to him after this? Did he just slink back to America defeated?
Oh, not at all. Koch was far from finished with his fossil adventures.
So even after going to London, even after Owen reassembled the Leviathan, Koch was still sticking with this idea that humans and mastodons had lived together.
It's like he just couldn't let that idea go. And, this was at a time when a lot of people were still really struggling to accept the idea that humans had even existed alongside extinct animals.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine now, but back
Yeah.
then it was a really radical concept.
It was. And Koch's insistence on this human-mastodon coexistence really started to rub some scientists the wrong way.
They weren't buying it.
Nope. One of Koch's biggest critics was a guy named Dr. P.R. Hoy. He was a respected naturalist, and he basically called Koch out on his claims.
Really? How so?
Well, Hoy looked at the evidence that Koch had presented, particularly the alleged discovery of arrowheads and other human-made objects alongside those mastodon bones, and he basically said, this just doesn't add up.
He thought Koch was making it up.
He didn't come right out and say that, but he strongly implied that Koch's accounts were unreliable and that his interpretations were flawed.
Ouch, that's gotta sting.
Yeah, it was pretty scathing critique. And, in hindsight, Hoy was right to be skeptical. Those arrowheads that Koch claimed to have found, they were actually much younger than the mastodon bones. Later dating techniques proved that.
So Koch was wrong about that specific piece of evidence? But what about the bigger question? Did humans and mastodons actually coexist?
Ah, well, that's where things get interesting. Because even though Koch was wrong about the arrowheads, his core idea wasn't entirely off base.
So he was right about humans and mastodons living together.
He was. Eventually, later discoveries, including some pretty convincing evidence of mastodon bones bearing the marks of human tools, confirmed that humans and mastodons did coexist in North America.
Wow, so Koch was right all along. Well, sort of. Anyway, what a vindication, even if it came along after he was gone. What about his creations? Did any of them survive?
Sadly, no. Most of Koch's grand creations met rather unfortunate ends. His great Zeuglodon, the supposed sea serpent that he sold to P.T. Barnum, was destroyed in the Great Chicago Fire in 1871.
Oh, wow, that's a shame.
It is. And his Hydrarchus, another sea serpent creation which he had sold to the King of Prussia, was mostly destroyed during World War II.
So all that's left is the Missouri Leviathan.
Well, the Leviathan still exists, but it's been reassembled correctly, of course, and it's on display at the Natural History Museum in London.
Oh yeah, as a mastodon, not as a giant aquatic beast.
Exactly. It's kind of ironic that the creation that sparked the most controversy is the one that ultimately survived in a recognizable form.
It's almost poetic in a way. What about those sites where Koch dug up those mastodon bones? Are any of them preserved?
Yes, actually the site in Kimmswick, Missouri, where Koch excavated some of the bones that would become part of the Leviathan, is now the Mastodon State Historic Site.
That's pretty cool.
Mm-hmm.
So even though Koch's methods were questionable, his work ultimately led to the preservation of this important fossil site.
It's a complicated legacy to be sure, but there's no doubt that Koch played a role in shaping our understanding of the ancient world.
Absolutely. He was a showman, a scientist, an entrepreneur, a bit of a huckster. He was a man of contradictions, but he was never boring.
That's for sure. He reminds us that the pursuit of knowledge is rarely a straight line. It's full of twists and turns, and sometimes those detours lead to unexpected discoveries.
And sometimes those discoveries change the way we see the world.
Exactly. Albert Koch's story is a reminder that history is full of complex figures who defy easy categorization. And it's in those gray areas where truth and fiction, passion and deception blur that we often find the most captivating stories.
So what do you think? Was Koch a deliberate hoaxer, a misguided enthusiast, or a bit of both? We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, share your thoughts on our social media. And if this deep dive has piqued your interest, consider visiting the Mastodon State Historic Site or exploring the Natural History Museum's online collection to see Koch's Leviathan for yourself.
It's a reminder that the past is never truly gone. It's waiting to be discovered, debated, and reinterpreted, just like those ancient bones that continue to captivate our imaginations.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep wondering.